So today I'm going to start a whole series walking you through my mixing process from start to finish. And we're going to start with a little discussion on mixing templates. A template is part of my mixing workflow, but it's not as important as you might think. A mixing template will not make up for a lack of mixing ability or knowledge, but it can speed up your workflow. Here's how I use mine. In my template, the most important thing are my sub buses and stereo bus routing. This is what I will import into every single mix and run all of my audio tracks through. Then I have some common parallel processing chains that I like to use in my mixing. I don't use these on every mix and I will import them on a session to session basis, but I don't want to have to set them up every time I need them. Then I have some more complex effects chains that I sometimes like to use in my mixes. I don't have every type of reverb or delay set up in here because I like to do that on the fly and be really creative with it. And finally, I have a few high quality reference tracks in here. And here's how I incorporate this template into my mixing workflow. I do not start the new session from template. I start with a blank Logic session. Then the first thing I do is go to File, Import Logic Projects, and choose my mixing template. Then I import just my submix and stereo bus tracks. Now I have all of the routing destinations for my audio tracks ready to go before I import anything. Having a logical and organized setup procedure for your mix sessions is key to working effectively. As we discussed last time, I already have my submix and stereo bus routing imported into the blank session. The first thing to do is to set the project tempo. For this song, it's going to be 119 BPM. Then I'm going to grab all of the audio files for the mix and drag and drop them into Logic. And I'll choose Create New Tracks. Now that I have all the relevant audio files in my session, I'm going to order them the way I like from top to bottom. After ordering the tracks, I'm going to color code the tracks. Hit Option C on your keyboard to bring up the color palette, and in the mix window, color your tracks based on groups of instruments. Blue for drums, brown for bass, and so on. Then back in the edit window, I'll highlight all of the tracks and hit Shift Option C to color the regions according to the track color. Next, I'll go through and set the routing for all the tracks. So in this process, I'm going to route the different instrument groups to their appropriate submix bus, and those submixes are already routed to my stereo bus. The final part of my setup is to load my default meters. I do this on the output bus of Logic. On this, I have the frequency analyzer from Blue Cat Audio, I have the Insight meters from iZotope, and I have my SonarWorks Sound ID reference EQ. Now, I'm not super meticulous about the gain staging of my audio tracks in my mix sessions. Some people will tell you to normalize everything to -18 or a different reference level, and that's fine, but I think that really comes from an analog style workflow and isn't super relative to a digital workflow. However, I do like to make sure that all of my audio tracks are in the same ballpark as far as initial level. To do this, I'm first visually looking at the tracks in the session. I do this without the waveform zoom on, so I can see if there are any tracks that are wildly quieter than other tracks. And as you can see on all the vocal tracks, we can barely see any waveforms, so they're much quieter than the rest of the tracks in the session. So I'm going to go ahead and boost them by 12 dBs, again, so they're at the same level as other tracks in the session. I'll also play them back quickly just to make sure I haven't gone too far with the gain adjustment. Now we can see waveforms on all of the tracks and things are in a similar ballpark. So now it's time to start working with our audio tracks. And the first thing I do is to mix the song using only the volume faders and the pan knobs. This is called a static mix. To start with, I'm going to select all of the stereo tracks in the session, right-click on the pan knob of one of them, and change the setting from balance to stereo pan. This way we're doing true stereo panning on our stereo tracks and not just lowering the volume of one or the other side. Next, I'm going to select all of the audio tracks in my session and bring their volumes all the way down. Then I'm going to loop the song and start pushing volume faders up. This process usually takes around 30 minutes, and you want to make sure to set the volume and pan position for every track in the session. Fight the urge to add any plugins or automation at this stage, that will come later. Just focus on making the mix sound as best as it possibly can, just using a static volume level and pan setting. At the end of this process, you'll have something like this. So now that our static mix is complete, the next step in my process is to work on my mix bus processing. I like to set the mix bus processing first before working on the individual tracks, because all of the processing on the mix bus will influence the sound of the entire mix. Therefore, it will influence your decisions you make on the individual tracks. The first thing I have across all of my submix buses and in the first spot on my mix bus is the Virtual Console collection from Slate Digital. Next is a compressor, and I use the SSL bus compressor emulation from Slate Digital mostly. And then the most important thing here is that I'm looking for between 1 and 2 dBs of gain reduction. I do not want to overcompress the sound at this stage. Next in line is some tape saturation. For this tune, we're going with the Virtual Tape Machine. Next, and this is a relatively new one in my workflow, is the Matte FiDef Gen 2. This is a psychoacoustic processor. To my ear, it gives more depth to the sound and kind of rounds things out and glues things together just slightly overall. And finally, this is a bit controversial, but I do like to mix with a limiter on the last spot of my output bus. And here's the before and after of our mix bus processing.
Your stare is not fair. Got me over the moon, I swear. Can't look away, I can't let it slip by.
Now that we've got our master bus processing set, it's time to start mixing the individual tracks of the session. For this process, I like to start by looping the biggest or most complex section of the song, usually the last chorus. That way I can touch as many of the tracks in the session as I can at one time. And I like to start by working on the drums. So the first thing I'm going to do is solo my kick drum track. That's going to be the foundation that I build from. In this song, there's 2 kick drum parts, so I'm going to create a track stack so I can process them together as a unit. And then we're just going to build the song up from that foundation by adding in tracks with the solo button one at a time. And I'll add any effects or processing that I think those tracks need as I go. I don't shy away from any type of processing at this point. It could be EQ or compression. I'll add reverb on buses. I could add some parallel processing chains, anything I think the track needs. This is the really creative part of the mixing process, and I am going purely on gut instinct here. As I add tracks in and they start to interact with each other, I make a gut decision on what I feel like it needs to enhance the sound, and I just go like that, building the track up from the ground floor. I will then repeat this same process for each different section of the song until I've worked on every single track in the session. Eventually, we'll get something like this.
Fresh eyes, those fresh eyes pulling me in though.
A-Bing means to compare the processed and unprocessed versions in order to decide if the processing you did is making the sound better. The most important thing you can do before switching on and off that bypass button is to volume match the before and after. Nothing will lead you astray more than the processed track being louder than the unprocessed track. Once you've got it volume matched, here's the method I use. Hover your mouse over the bypass button, close your eyes, and then rapidly left click your mouse enough times so that you don't know which state the plugin is in, on or off. Then take a few bars to listen to one state, then with your eyes still closed, click the mouse, and take a few bars and listen to the next state. Do this a few times until in your mind you say, yeah, this is the one that sounds better. That'll make your decision as to whether you've actually improved the sound of the track or not. EQ is the single most important tool in a mixer's toolkit. Here's my method to properly EQ a track. For this example, we're going to be focusing on this synth arpeggio track, which is the most recent track that I've brought into the mix using my Stack by Solo method. The first step in the process is to listen to the track in context and ask yourself, what does this track need? Does it have too much of something or too little of something? Is it not standing out enough or is it standing out too much? My answers for this specific track is that it sounds a little muddy and undefined in the high mids, and it's also standing out a bit too much and not sitting in the mix properly. To find the problem area, I'm going to first boost one band of the EQ by about 12 dB and use a moderate Q, not too wide, not too narrow. Then I'm just going to slowly sweep up and down the frequency spectrum until I find the area that is most offensive to my ear. For this track, it's right above 1K, so that's where I'm going to add a little cut. And I'll pull the gain down just until it feels right to my ear. Compression is probably the second most used tool in my toolbox after EQ, but it is certainly one of the most misunderstood tools in all of audio production. Here's how I would encourage you to start thinking about and listening to compression. Try to hear beyond just the threshold and ratio settings and how much gain reduction is happening, and start to focus more on the attack and release times. This is really where the tone shaping ability of a compressor come in. And you should try to hear that the attack and release times are changing the relationship between the initial transient of the sound and the sustain of the sound. So in this example, we're going to focus on this guitar part. Check out what happens to the graph when I turn the attack from its fastest setting to its slowest setting. You'll see that that initial triangle shape that indicates the compressor starting has widened. It's taking more time for the compressor to react to the signal going over the threshold. Also, look at the difference in the relationship between that initial triangle and then the following sustain when I turn the release from its fastest setting to its slowest setting. Because with the slow release, the compressor is staying engaged longer, we get less of a difference between that initial transient and the sustain, bringing them closer together in volume. Parallel processing is simply sending your track out a bus to an auxiliary track and then doing your affecting on that auxiliary track and mixing it in with the original signal. One of my favorite ways to use parallel processing is to do a heavily distorted sound on the aux track and mix it in with my bass track. First, we're going to send our bass track out a new bus. I'm going to make sure that bus is routed to my all bass submix. And then we want to send 100% of the original track to the aux track. Then I want to add an EQ where I take out pretty much all of the low end. And then I'm going to add some distortion. For this, I'm going to go with the Devil Lock from Soundtoys. And there you go. You can hear how much more that's bringing out the bass. Obviously, this is too high, but we'll mix it into taste using the volume fader on the aux track. Adding a spatial element to your mix can be achieved through things like reverb and delay, or through EQing. The less top end something has, the further away it generally sounds. However, I want you to think of adding space as a problem-solving tool and not just something that you have to do. For example, in this sparse chorus section of the song, the kick drum really has to take up a lot of space and carry the groove of the song entirely. Because it was still feeling a little empty to me in this section, I decided to experiment with adding an ambience reverb to the kick drum. So I'll send my kick sub out a new bus. On that bus, I'm gonna add the Valhalla Vintage Verb plugin. And for this trick, I like to use the preset called Drum Air. And there you go, you can hear how much more space the kick drum takes up now just by adding this really short reverb to it. Now, outboard gear is not a huge part of my mixing process, but occasionally I do like to use some outboard pieces of equipment to enhance the tracks in my mix. Thankfully, Logic Pro makes this so easy to do. In this song, I wasn't totally happy with the tone of this guitar track. And since the initial track was just a dry signal, I decided to reamp it using my Avid 11 rack. So to get all the routing and everything set up super easily, we're going to use the utility stock plugin called I/O. This allows you to route the signal out into your outboard gear and back into Logic and have everything act just like a plugin. It's super cool. And then the most handy part of this plugin is you can automatically detect the latency and have Logic compensate for it. You even have a dry and wet knob to mix in the effect to taste. Then I can mess around with the settings on my outboard gear as much as I want and hear the changes happening in real time in my session. Of course, we can also add other plugins to this plugin chain and really shape the sound of this guitar part as much as we want to. And the final thing I always do when using outboard gear is come over to the notes section and go to the track specific notes and write down the settings of my outboard gear. I'm gonna break my vocal processing up into several videos because it's one of my most requested tutorials. And the first step is EQ. Before we get started, let's note we have a hard auto-tune effect at the front of this vocal chain. That's what the artist wanted for this song, and it will affect how we EQ the track. Same process as EQing any other track. We're first going to listen to it without EQ and decide what problems we need to solve. In this track, I'm hearing some harshness in the top end. So I'm gonna sweep around the top end with a bell curve and see if I can pinpoint the area. And one of the great things about the FabFilter Pro Q is we can hit this little headphone icon and solo just the band we're working on. So I'm hearing that harshness jump out right here around 4K, so that's where I'm gonna apply my cut. Next, I'm hearing a little boxiness in the mid-range. So again, I'm gonna find that by boosting an EQ and sweeping around until the problem frequency jumps out to my ear. Next, because auto-tune often can make vocals sound a bit brittle and thin, I want to apply a boost in the low end. Okay, I found a nice sweet spot here around 150, but because I want to add some warmth and color to it, I'm not going to actually use the FabFilter. I'm going to switch to an analog style EQ for extra warmth. And the final thing I like to do when EQing pop vocals is add a little bit of air on the top end to help the vocal really stand out in front of the mix. My goal with using compression on vocals is twofold. One, I want to even out the performance in terms of dynamics, and also I want to add some weight and character to the tone. To do this, I use a two-stage compression process. The first compressor I use will be a fast attack style compressor, something like an 1176. And with this, I'm gonna set a quick attack and release time, and my goal is to grab the peaks, the things that are jumping out in the vocal performance, and rein them back in. I'm looking for somewhere between 3 and a maximum of 5 dBs of gain reduction on the loudest phrases of the vocal. The next step in my compression process will be a de-esser. This is just going to rein in the sibilants and make sure we don't have an overly harsh vocal. I find this especially important in a bright pop mix like this. Go for about 4 dBs of gain reduction on the S's and T's and you're good to go. And the final compressor I'll use will be something that naturally has a slower attack. An opto style compressor is great for this, and I love using an LA2A. The goal here is to really glue the sound of the vocal together and make sure that everything is at an even level. And also I find the LA2A really adds a great weight and character to the sound. And a quick note on plugin order. I like to have the fast attack compressor after my subtractive EQ, but before my additive EQ. And then I like to have the de-esser followed by my slow attack compressor after my additive EQ. My process for mixing background vocals is pretty similar to lead vocals, but there's a different goal in mind. The goal here is to have the background vocals wrap around and support the lead vocal, adding weight and depth to the overall vocal sound. Again, we're going to start just as before by listening to the tracks unprocessed and deciding what problems we need to address. The first thing that jumps out to my ear is that the high background vocals are a little too present and need to be tucked back in the high end. So I'll achieve this with a high shelf EQ. Next, I want the lower background vocals to be a little warmer and add a little more weight to the tone. So I'll do this by boosting around 300 Hertz. For compression, it's pretty similar to the lead vocal with a little bit of a tweak. Again, we're going to start with a fast attack style compressor to grab the peaks and even out the performance. We're going to follow that up with a de-esser, but then I like to do any analog additive EQ and my final slow attack compressor on the background vocal bus. This will help glue all of the background vocals together because they're all being run through this same processing chain, and that final stage compression will really act as that glue to glue them all together and help them really sit behind and support the lead vocal. I'm going to use a distressor emulation in opto mode for this, so that's its slowest attack time, fastest release time, and then the 10:1 ratio setting. Now, the specific types of vocal effects you're going to want to use in your mix are very song dependent. But here's a few things that I use a lot of the time to help give you some starting points. I'm pretty much always going to start with some type of reverb on my lead vocal, usually a plate reverb. And I'm always going to put this on a bus 100% wet to send my dry signal of the vocal through. I also like to start my reverb chain with a little bit of EQ, with a high pass filter and a low pass filter to just take out any of the extremes. The specific length and type and color of the reverb really just depends on the song, and I'm going to tweak these settings by ear. The next thing I like to add to my lead vocal only is a very short tape style slap delay. This is something under 70 milliseconds with no feedback and a little bit of high cut, and I find this really helps the vocal stand out that little bit extra in front of the mix. Another trick I like to use is to automate on some type of stereo delay in the chorus or loudest section of the song. I find this helps give the vocal an extra lift in the chorus and amps up that energy of the section even more. For background vocals, I'm usually going to keep it pretty simple with effects, just a reverb and maybe delay if I think it needs it. A lot of times I like to send my background vocals to a different type of reverb than the lead, something with a little longer decay and a little more reverberated sound to help sit them back in the mix more. Also, don't be afraid to EQ after your reverb plugin on your reverb chain. Now, I will add automation as I go when inspiration strikes, but I always set time aside near the end of my mix to go through the whole session and add automation to any tracks that need it. This could be using the marquee tool to raise or lower the volume of a track in certain sections of the song. It could be automating a bus send on a track for different sections of a song. It could be automating a plugin parameter to add an effect, like this high cut sweep in the bridge synth. And then I will always use a physical volume fader to ride the lead vocal. I find this helps give dynamism to the lead vocal and helps it stand out more in the mix. I will also use a physical fader to ride any other tracks that I feel like need a little more fine tuning with automation or some effects that require a fader. And be sure to use the proper automation mode for the goal that you want to accomplish. For example, on this delay track, I'm going to use touch mode to quickly silence it during this transition, but then when I lift my finger off the fader, it will return to its original volume. Transitions are a really key point to use automation in. This could be adding reverb or delay to help carry the transition, or one of my favorite tricks to use is to boost just the initial hit of the drums on a new song section. This can help add punch and weight and energy to the new song section. Eventually, your automation lanes will look something like this. Every song is different, but automation is super key to a polished, professional sounding mix. Knowing when a mix is done is a skill all in itself. But here's the method I use to know if my mix is finished. I call it the red flag test. So you're gonna listen through your song from the start to the finish, and whenever a red flag goes up in your head saying, hey, something's not right here, I need to make a change, you stop and you address that issue. Then you start back at the beginning and keep playing through the song until the next red flag comes up. This can really be anything. It could be volume automation adjustment. A lot of times I will add some EQ to my submix buses just to make a small sweeping change to a group of instruments in this process. It could be adding plugins. It could be changing bus send levels. Really anything. In this song, for my final test, I decided that the lead vocal needed a little something extra. So I decided to add this cool octave down, kind of fuzzed out effect behind the lead in the verses. This is also the stage in which I will listen to my mix on headphones and also through my mono Avantone speaker. Once you can play through from the start to the finish of the song without any red flags going up, you know you're done. Over the last 18 videos, I've shared a detailed breakdown of my mixing process. Here's a few things I hope you took away from this series. 1. It is important to have a process for mixing you can lean on. You don't have to follow mine exactly, but I encourage you to develop your own process that works for you and allows you to mix effectively and efficiently. 2. Every mix and every situation in a mix is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all processing to any situation in a mix, and you have to think critically and uniquely about every mix you approach to make sure you're making the right decisions for that artist and that song. 3. Use your plugins to solve problems. Don't put a plugin on a track just because you think you should, or you read somewhere that it's a good idea to put X plugin on X track. Always ask yourself, what is the problem I'm trying to solve here, and use your plugins to solve that problem. And finally, always ask yourself if you are making things better. You do this with proper A/Bing and always listening to the reference mix that the artist has provided you. You want to make sure you are both improving upon the sound and staying true to the artist's vision at all times. If you need help with mixing, production, or Logic Pro, send me a message. I would love to help you out.